He cut her loose from the windmill frame, the slate reed oath breaker. The rope was wet. That's the first thing I noticed. Not the woman, not the slate someone had nailed to the windmill post at her feet, the one with those two words burned into it. The rope first, soaked through from the night's rain, dark and tight as a tourniquet where it crossed her wrists above her head, and the frame she was lashed to was iron, so the cold had gotten into everything. Her hands had gone the color of a bruise. I'd ridden out to check the windmill because the cattle hadn't come to the south tank in 2 days, and I figured the pump had seized. It does that in the cold. The fan locks up, the rod stops turning, and the water just sits there underground while the cattle stand around looking stupid. Happened twice already that fall. First time I didn't know to watch for it, lost 2 days getting the mechanism freed up again. Second time I caught it in half a morning. Third time I told myself I'd check the thing regular, and then I didn't, because the weather had been mild and the cattle had been coming and there were other things to do. There are always other things to do. That's what I've learned about work. It doesn't end, it just redistributes. You finish one piece of it and 2 more come forward to take its place, and if you're a man working alone it can feel like you're fighting a tide. Which I was. Had been since I bought this place, which was 6 years before that morning, with what was left after the sell in Harker and the lawyer and the months of nothing. But I'm getting ahead of myself, the rope first. I came over the rise and I saw her from maybe 200 yards. Just a shape at first, the way anything looks at that distance in that kind of flat gray morning light. The sky had that particular November quality, not dark exactly, just the light all flattened and even, no shadows, no real depth to anything. The land under it looked staged. It's the kind of morning where you trust what you already know and go careful about anything new. I thought it was laundry somebody'd hung there, which didn't make sense. Nobody owned a house near this windmill, and there wasn't a line, but that's what the mind reaches for when it doesn't want to know what it's actually seeing. Then the shape shifted, just a little, and I knew. I put my heels to the horse. Up close she was younger than I expected, mid-20s maybe, dark hair, wet and matted, plastered down one side of her face like someone had poured water over her. She had on a canvas coat that wasn't doing her much good in the cold, a man's coat by the look of the cut and the size of it, with the collar worn through at one edge, and her boots were mud-caked past the ankle. One of her bootlaces had broken and been tied back together in a square knot. I noticed that. Don't know why. Details come at you, in a moment like that, in no particular order. She'd been there a while. The ground under her feet was packed where she'd been shifting weight all night, working to keep the blood moving, keep herself from going down. The mud was pressed smooth in a circle about 8 inches across, which is exactly what you'd get if a person spent hours moving their feet the smallest amount they could while their hands were fixed above their head. She looked at me when I rode up and her eyes were clear. That surprised me. I thought she'd be out of her head by then, 20 hours in the cold with no sleep, hands tied above her heart, but she wasn't. She was scared, she was cold, she was past exhausted, but she was right there behind her eyes, looking at me and deciding what I was. She said, "You going to cut me down or read the sign?" I got down off the horse. The slate was rough timber, the kind you use for fencing, and whoever had burned those words in had done it with a running iron. You could tell from the char pattern, the way the letters were thick in the middle and tapered at the ends where the iron had been moving. Oath breaker. Burned in deep, not scratched. They'd wanted it to last through weather. They'd been thinking about the long view when they made it. I pulled my knife and went to work on the rope. The knots were so wet and tight I couldn't find an edge to work against, so I just cut. The rope fell away and she came down off her toes. She'd been up on her toes, I realized, because that was the only way to take some of the pressure off her wrists, and her legs folded under her. I caught her by the arms, and she made a sound, not a cry, more like a word that didn't make it all the way out, and I held her up while the feeling started to come back into her hands. That's a particular kind of pain, that return. Anyone who's worked in real cold knows it. Your hands go numb and you stop feeling them, and that's almost a mercy. And then the blood comes back in and it feels like you've shoved your fists into a fire. There's nothing gradual about it. You go from numb to fire and there's nothing in between. I held her by the forearms while she got through it, and she pressed her forehead against my shoulder and breathed hard, even, controlled, like she was counting through the pain rather than fighting it. Smart. That's smarter than most people manage when they're hurting. You fight pain and it beats you. You breathe through it and it passes. Then she straightened up. She looked at the slate where it sat in the mud after I'd kicked it off the post. Something went through her face that wasn't shame. It was harder than shame and older. Something closer to contempt. She said, "Thank you." I said, "Who put you up there?" She looked at me, taking stock of me, same as I was doing to her. Then she decided something, or decided enough. She said, "Men from Harlan Cress's outfit." I knew that name. I knew it the way you know a scar, by the particular shape of the hurt it left, and the story behind the shape, and the fact that you stopped being surprised about it a long time ago. But I didn't say any of that. I said, "How long were you up there?" "Since before dark yesterday." "Better part of 20 hours. I looked at her hands. The color was starting to come back unevenly, mottled red and white, and the skin across both wrists was raw where the rope had been, not broken but close. Rope burn in cold is slower to show than in heat. The real damage sometimes doesn't surface until the next day when the inflammation sets in. She needed heat and food and time, not necessarily in that order. I untied my horse from where I'd looped the reins around the windmill frame. I'd have to come back for the pump, and said, "Can you ride?" She said, "I can do whatever I need to do." We rode double back to my place. The ride took 20 minutes at a careful pace, picking our way across the pasture and up the creek bank. She sat behind me without holding on at first, balanced by habit, which told me she'd been in a saddle most of her life. Then the cold got to her and she gripped my coat, both hands in the rough canvas of it, and I could feel her shivering through the thickness of the fabric. She didn't say anything about it. I didn't either. My place isn't much, wasn't then, isn't now. A frame house that my father started and I finished badly, the north wall plumb, the south wall with a tilt to it that I've since corrected twice and will probably correct again. A barn that leans a degree or two to the west, something to do with the footer my father laid in a wet year, and a bunkhouse I've used for storage since there's been nobody else to sleep in it. The bunkhouse was tighter than the main house in some ways, better insulated. I'd stacked hay bales against the north face of it for warmth. The land is good, though. Creek bottom, reliable water, grass that comes back even in the dry years because the water table is close enough to the surface that the roots find it. My father understood that when he picked the spot. He was a deliberate man, my father. Didn't do things without understanding why. Looking at the buildings, though, anybody could tell you a lot about the man who kept them. That he got by. That he didn't have anybody asking more of him or the place. That the work was done but nothing beyond it. I got her inside and put her by the stove while I built it up. The fire was down to coals. I'd left early and banked it, and it took me a few minutes to get it moving again. While I worked I was thinking, which is something I do better with my hands occupied. Harlan Cress. She'd said his name like she'd been saying it for a while, with that particular flatness you get when you've had time to get past the anger and arrive at something more durable. Cress owned the biggest spread in the county. Had for as long as I could remember. And I'd been in this country most of my life with a gap of about 10 years in the middle when I was elsewhere. He'd built it piece by piece the way a man builds something when the cost to someone else isn't a factor in his arithmetic. When I came back to this country, he had the bank, the sheriff, and the mayor's ear, 3 legs of a stool that held up everything he wanted held up, and below the stool was everything else. His men putting a woman on a windmill frame with a sign around her neck, that was a message, always was, when Cress's people did something like that. The question I was turning over was who the message was aimed at. Sometimes it's the person on the frame. Sometimes it's the country around the frame, everyone who will hear about it afterward. Sometimes both. I got the fire going and put coffee on and came back out to where she was sitting. She'd pulled her coat off and her hands were wrapped around her own elbows, trying to generate some warmth from the inside. "My name is Callie Greer," she said, and there was something in the way she said it, no preamble, no apology for being found on a Windmill post, that I respected. I had a claim on the creek section north of Porterville. 80 acres, legal title, filed in Mercer County 3 years ago. I waited. Cress wants that section. It's the only stretch between his north range and the rail spur they're planning. He's offered. I've refused. She looked at her hands, turning them over, checking the damage. 4 times. And the oath breaker. She was quiet for a moment. Not reluctant, just measuring how much of the story was necessary. My husband worked for Cress before he died. He told Cress certain things about the water rights on that stretch of creek, about what terms might be acceptable for a sale that I didn't know he'd told. They had some kind of conversation that I was never part of. She looked up. When Cress came to me after the funeral, he said there was an arrangement, that my husband had as much as agreed. That I was bound by it. And you told him you weren't. I told him my husband didn't own me, and whatever arrangement Cress thought he had died with him. She said it plainly, without heat. Cress called that breaking an oath. I let that sit in the air a moment, then I said, "Where were you staying?" "Boarding house in town. I expect my things are gone by now. The landlady had an agreement with the bank and the bank's Cress's." She wasn't wrong about that, probably. "You can stay here," I said, "until you figure your next step." She looked at me with that same measuring quality she'd had on the Windmill, not unfriendly, just careful, trying to read what the offer cost. "I don't know you." "Name's Cord Wills." Something moved across her face. She knew the name. Most people in the county did, and not in the way that was useful to a man. She said, "I've heard of you." "I expect you have." She didn't soften it, didn't apologize for knowing it. Just looked at me straight and said, "They say you killed a man you were supposed to be protecting." I said, "That's what they say." "Is it true?" I got up and went to check the coffee, not because it needed checking, but because some things are easier to say when you're not looking at a person. "He was trying to burn down a family's house," I said to the stove, "with the family in it, so I stopped him. The man who hired me to ride for him didn't see it that way. Said I'd broken contract, he'd hired me to protect his property, not to interfere with family business." I came back and sat. "The man I stopped was his brother." She was quiet. I said, "I lost my badge over it, lost the position, lost the money I was owed, which was considerable because I'd been with that outfit 3 years. I looked at the table. Spent 3 months in a cell in Harker because the judge owed Denton Farr a favor. When I got out, there wasn't a job in 2 counties that would take me on. So I bought this place for what I had left, and I've been here since." She said, "Who was in the house?" "A woman and 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. The boy was 6. She looked at me for a long time, and then something settled in her face, and I understood that the question she'd been working on had gotten answered to her satisfaction, and we were past it. She said, "All right." That first week she slept in the bunkhouse. I cleared it out as best I could, shifted the hay, swept it, found an old cot that was sound enough and a blanket I could spare, cleaned the lamp glass and trimmed the wick. She didn't complain about any of it. Didn't comment on the dust or the spare setup or the hay smell that would have been in everything. Just looked at it, said it would do, and that was that. She was up before me every morning. I didn't know this at first. I'd been rising at 5, which I thought was early, and the first day I came out to the barn at 5 past 5, she'd already fed the horses and mucked out the 2 near stalls. I stood in the barn door and looked at the clean stalls and the horses with their heads down in the feed bucket, and I didn't say anything because I didn't have the right thing to say. Thanking her would have made it sound like a surprise, which it was, but saying so seemed rude. So I just went to work on the far stall, and we worked alongside each other without talking much for the first hour of daylight. That became the pattern. Work first, words later, and only as many words as were needed. I found I didn't mind it. I'd been alone long enough that I'd gotten used to the quiet, but this was a different kind of quiet, inhabited, not empty. There's a difference that you notice more than you'd expect. Her hands healed in about 4 days. The rope burns scabbed over clean, no infection, and she stopped favoring them by midweek. I noticed she never mentioned them, never looked at them when she thought I was watching, just worked with them and let them get better on their own. On the 5th day she rode into town. The sorrel mare, which she'd asked about and I'd said she could use. She didn't ask my permission to go and didn't tell me her plans, which was right. She wasn't a guest in a way that required my approval. She came back by midday with a canvas bag behind the saddle and news. She set the bag on the bunkhouse step and came to find me. She said the landlady had kept my things. Someone told her not to bother, which was kind. She paused. And Cress filed a counterclaim on my section. I straightened up from the fence post I'd been setting, looked at her. On what grounds? Disputed survey. His man says the original plat was wrong, that the section boundaries overlap his deeded land. She said it with the same flat evenness she used for most things, but I'd started to learn the difference between her flat even and her holding something back. This was the second kind. His surveyor is Gale Prout. I knew that name too. Prout was one of those men who kept their skills available to whoever would pay for a particular result. He was licensed, technically competent, and had no apparent conscience about where his work ended up. In a county where Cress had the influence he had, Prout was a useful man to know. I said, "When's the hearing?" 30 days, Mercer County Courthouse. 30 days wasn't much. That was Cress's move: file fast, set a short timeline, apply as much pressure in as concentrated a period as possible, and hope the other side doesn't have time to organize. It had probably worked on other people. He'd have done this before. I said, "You have your original deed." Locked in a strongbox at the Porterville Bank. I looked at her. She said, "I know." Cress's bank. She already knew that was a problem. I said, "You need to get that deed somewhere he can't reach it. The counterclaim alone isn't enough to justify holding your own property, but that won't stop someone from losing a key." She said, "I know. That's why I'm going back tomorrow." I said I'd go with her. She didn't argue, which I took as a kind of trust, or at least a practical acknowledgement that 2 people walking into that bank had a different weight than one. That evening I cooked what I had, which wasn't much: dried beans I'd had soaking, salt pork, the last of a loaf I'd made earlier in the week. Not a meal you'd brag about. She ate it without comment and helped herself to more of the beans, which I took to mean she'd been hungry. We sat at the table after, and I poured a second cup of coffee, and she had one too, and for a while neither of us said anything. The lamp was turned low because the chimney needed trimming, and a high flame made it smoke. The light it put out was dim enough that the corners of the room were dark. She said, "Tell me about this place. How you ended up here." I told her. My father had come out from Ohio in 1861, which was a complicated time to be moving, but he had his reasons and none of them were avoidance. He'd had land there, his family's land, and he'd sold it to pay a debt his brother owed and come west with what was left, which wasn't much. He found the creek section, smaller then, just 40 acres, and he bought it because the water was right and the grass came back, and he understood, in the way some men understand a place without being able to explain it, that this was ground worth staying on. He built slowly, added to the land over 20 years, piece by piece, as adjacent sections came available, married late. My mother came from a settlement east of Porterville, a family who'd come out from Illinois a year after my father, and they met at a supply run and were married 8 months later, which was fast but made sense if you knew them. My father was not a man who deliberated past the point of clarity. He knew what he was doing when he was doing it. He proposed to my mother at a third meeting because, by the third meeting, he knew enough and waiting longer would have been dishonest. She died when I was 12, a fever, quick and bad. My father grieved in the way he did everything contained, not spoken about, but present in every choice he made after it. He worked harder mostly. He kept the place up in ways that went past necessity, kept her garden going even though gardens are work, and he had no particular aptitude for them. I understood later that the garden was for her, the same way some men keep a chair. He died when I was 17, which is a hard age to be orphaned, and he left me the land and a debt I spent 3 years trying to clear and couldn't. I didn't tell her the next part. That was a different conversation, but she'd heard enough of it already to know the shape. She said, "Your father sounds like a solid man." I said, "He was the best man I knew." She nodded, not to fill space, not a social nod, the kind of nod that means, "I understand that, I believe it, and I know what it's worth." She said, "My father was a drunk. Not a mean drunk, just a useless one, good for 3 things: stories, laughter, and making promises that fell apart." She looked at the lamp. I figured out early that I was going to have to be the solid thing in my own life. My husband was better than my father, but some of what I'd already built in myself, you don't undo. I said, "You don't want to." She looked at me, then she almost smiled. "No, you don't." The bank the next morning. The manager's name was Dowd, thin, careful, with the manner of a man who had learned to be agreeable in ways that didn't commit him to anything. He looked at Callie and at me and made a quick calculation that showed in the tightening around his eyes. Callie asked for access to her strongbox. Dowd said there was a hold on the box pending resolution of the land dispute. Callie said her deed was her property, and a land dispute didn't change that. Dowd said he'd received instructions. I said, "From who?" Dowd looked at me. He knew my name, I could see it. He was adding things up. I said, "A customer's personal property in a strongbox is not bank property. It's not subject to any hold or lien without a court order. Do you have a court order, Mr. Dowd?" He said he'd have to check. I said, "I'll wait." He went in the back. He was gone long enough, nearly 10 minutes, that I knew he was sending word somewhere, not checking paperwork. There were 2 tellers who kept their eyes on their work very carefully. A man in a town suit near the door shifted his weight twice and then left. When Dowd came back, he said he didn't have a court order, and he opened the box room. Callie came out with the deed and a small bundle of other papers. She put them inside her coat, against her chest, and buttoned it. We walked out of the Porterville Bank into the cold morning air, and neither of us said anything until we were well clear of the main street. Then I let out a breath. She said, "You knew he didn't have an order." I thought he probably didn't. Cress moves fast, but courts still need paperwork and signatures. He wouldn't have had time to get a legitimate hold order filed and signed in 5 days. And if he had, I said, then Dowd would have come back in 2 minutes, not 10. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Where are we taking these?" I told her about August Pell. Pell was in the county recorder's office in Harker, which was a day's ride east. I'd known him since I was a boy. He'd known my father, worked alongside him on some county boundary matters years before I was born, and he'd been one of the 3 or 4 people who'd shown any decency to me in the period after the sell. He'd come to see me once, when I was first back on the land and trying to figure what I had left. He'd sat at the table and not said much and then said, "What you did was right, Cord. Time has a way of sorting that out," and left. It wasn't much, but it was more than most. I explained this to Callie as we rode. She listened and asked one question, whether Pell could be pressured. I said that if he could, Cress would already have tried, and that Pell was still in his position after 25 years and 3 county administrations, which was its own kind of answer. We made camp that night at the creek crossing 20 miles east. The weather had held cold but no wind, the sky clear enough to show stars. I had a bedroll for each of us and enough distance between them to be proper, though by that time the formality felt slightly absurd, given that I'd been holding her up while her hands thawed 5 days earlier. We ate cold food. I hadn't wanted to risk a fire and draw attention from any riders on the road, and sat with our backs against a cottonwood and looked at the stars for a while. She said, "What would you do if you lost this, the land?" I thought about that. I said, "I don't know, I've thought about it. It's the only thing that's fully mine in the sense that nobody can question whether I earned it. I didn't earn it, it was my father's, but it's mine by the truest kind of right, which is having kept it going and made it better. If someone took it, I thought about it more. I'd go somewhere else and start. I'd have to, but I'd be less. Something in me would be less that wouldn't grow back." She was quiet. I said, "You?" She said, "Same. Those 80 acres are the only thing I've ever built myself. Not inherited, not given. I filed that claim with my own money and I've worked it every summer since, and when I walk across it I know every piece of it. Where the creek goes alkaline in dry years, where the grass comes up early, where the rock shelf is just under the surface and you can't plant anything there." She paused. "That's mine. That's not the kind of thing that gets negotiated away." We were quiet for a long while after that. The horses shifted in their pickets. The creek made its sound over the stones. She said, "I'm glad it was you." I said, "What?" "Who came to check the windmill?" I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything adequate. The next morning we found Pell. He was the same as I remembered, 60-something, white-haired, with a desk buried under more paper than most courtrooms see in a year, and a filing system that he claimed was logical, but that nobody else had ever deciphered. He looked up when we came in, and something in his face settled when he saw me, the way things settle when something you were hoping for shows up. He said, "Cord Wills." I said, "Mr. Pell." He looked at Callie, then back at me, and the look was neither approving nor disapproving, just noting. Then he said, "What do you need?" I told him the situation from the beginning. The original claim, the counterclaim, Prout's survey, the timeline. He listened the way he always had, completely, not breaking in, turning it over as I went. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said Prout's name the way you say the name of something you already had a file on. He went to a cabinet along the wall and pulled out a ledger, thick, cloth-bound, the kind of record that's been built up page by page over years. He found what he was looking for and read it without showing it to us. Then he went to another drawer and came back with a map, folded many times, that had the particular look of something handled often. He spread it on the desk and put his finger on a section. He said the original survey for this parcel was done by Thomas Greer in 1871. He looked at Callie. "Your father-in-law?" His father, yes. Thomas Greer was a licensed surveyor. He filed this plat with the territorial office before Mercer County was organized. It predates Cress's title on the adjacent land by 6 years. He studied the map. Now Prout's counter-survey relies on this benchmark. His finger moved to a mark on the map. This rock formation, east face, it's been used as a fixed point by every surveyor who's worked this part of the county. I have records of 3 other surveys that reference it. He looked up over his glasses. All 3 place it within a few feet of where Thomas Greer placed it. Prout places it 40 yards north. He looked at us both. 40 yards is not a measurement error, not with this formation. It's prominent, you can see it from a quarter mile. He folded his hands. I had occasion to look at Prout's work once before, on a different matter, and I made some notes at the time. I'm going to add those notes and what we've discussed here today to the county record as a notation attached to the Greer parcel file. He looked at Callie. That makes it a public record. Any judge who pulls the file on this parcel will see it before he hears a word of testimony. Callie said, will it be enough? Pell said, it gives you ground to stand on. What you build on that ground depends partly on the lawyer you bring. He spent the better part of an hour on the paperwork. I watched him work, precise, methodical, each notation in the same careful hand he'd probably used for 30 years. When he was done, he handed Callie a receipt for the filing and shook her hand. He shook mine too and looked at me directly and said, good thinking, bringing her here. Outside on the street, Callie held the receipt in both hands and I could see her working to keep her face steady. She was not a person who cried easily, that was clear, but she had the look of someone who was managing something close to it. She said, I want to win this. I said, that's a start. She looked at me. I mean, I want to actually win it, not settle, not take some compromise Cress offers because I'm tired, win it outright. The look in her eyes was the same one I'd seen when she looked at the slate on the windmill, hard and certain. He put me on that post. He burned that word into that board and left me there to freeze or be found or whatever happened. And I want him to lose this in a courtroom in front of people. I said, then we need a lawyer. She said, do you know one? I said I did. I told her about Sefton. We stayed the night in Harker, same boarding house which was clean and kept a good kitchen. We ate supper at the same table and for a while we didn't talk about any of it, not Cress or the deed or Prout or the hearing. She asked me about my father again. Wanted to know specifics, what he'd planted, how he'd worked the creek, what kind of cattle he'd run. The kind of questions that come from genuine interest, not from filling silence. I told her, the way he'd run a mix of cattle, not purebred anything, because he believed mixed stock was hardier in this country, and he'd been right. The way he'd planted windbreaks of cottonwood on the north side of the buildings before anyone thought that was necessary, and then had the satisfaction of watching everyone else's buildings get damaged in the big wind of 1874 while his stood. His opinions on horses, which were strong, varied, and occasionally baffling. The way he could look at a piece of ground and tell you 3 things about it before he'd set foot on it. I said he had the kind of knowledge that can't be written down. It's in the touch of it, in the years of watching. She said, are you like him? I said, I try to be. She said, I think you are, more than you know. There was nothing particular to say to that, so I didn't say anything, and she seemed to understand that. We talked past 10 o'clock, which was late for both of us. The dining room had emptied out, and the woman who ran the place came through twice to bank the kitchen fire and looked at us both times with an expression that was neither approving nor disapproving, just noting. When we finally said good night and went to our separate rooms, I stood at the window for a while looking at the street, thinking about the morning and Sefton and the 30 days, thinking about the look on Callie's face when she said she wanted to win it outright, thinking about what it would mean to stand between her and Cress for 30 days with nothing but a damaged name and some borrowed ground. I thought about what my father would have said if I could have asked him. He would have said, you know what you're doing. Do it. Sefton was 40 miles east in a town called Bream, where he'd set up practice after some trouble of his own that I won't go into because it's not mine to tell. I'd known him years before, when he was in Harker, and I was riding for an outfit in that part of the country. He was a careful lawyer, not flashy, not particularly eloquent, but thorough and honest, which in my experience are rarer qualities in a courtroom than they should be. I didn't write ahead. I just showed up on a Thursday morning with Callie and the papers. He looked at me the way old acquaintances do when they're not sure whether to be glad or to brace themselves. I said, I need your help. He said, tell me. I told him. He read the deed and the filing receipt from Pell and the notes I'd written about the survey discrepancy and the timeline, and then he read them again, which was his habit. When he was done, he set everything flat on his desk and thought about it. He said, Pell's notation is valuable. He has a reputation that's hard to attack. He's been in that office longer than most of the people who try to discredit him have been in the county. He picked up the survey notes. If I can commission an independent survey before the hearing, a qualified man who has no connection to Cress or to this dispute, and if he finds the same discrepancy the other surveys show, then Pruitt's survey is standing alone against 5. He looked up. That's a problem for a judge to explain away. He told us what it would cost. I had most of it. Callie had some. We talked about the horse I could sell without hurting the operation. We talked about what she had left. He said, if you can cover the surveyor, I'll take the rest in agreement once the land is secured. If you lose, you owe me nothing except the cost of the survey. Callie looked at him for a moment and then said, why? He said, because what you're describing is a man using a false survey to take land that isn't his from a woman who filed legal title on it fair and square. I'm a lawyer. That bothers me more than it should. She looked at him a moment longer, then she said, thank you. He sent for the surveyor from Colfax that afternoon. The next 3 weeks I want to describe carefully, because they mattered in a way I didn't fully understand until later. We worked the ranch. Fall on a working place means fencing, always does, and there were breaks in the south pasture that had been on my list for 2 months. Callie worked alongside me as if she'd been doing it for years. She knew how to set a post right, knew to tamp the fill in layers rather than all at once, knew to check level from 2 directions, knew to read the ground before you dug so you weren't fighting buried rock. Things that take years to learn, usually from someone who already knew. I asked her once who taught her. She said, my husband, some of it. The rest I figured out when he wasn't around, which was often enough. I said he was away a lot. He rode for Cress's outfit, which meant long seasons on the North Range, sometimes the high summer pasture. I ran the 80 acres mostly alone. She strung a length of wire tight and tied it off. That's why I know it so well. Everything I know about that land I learned alone on it. I thought about that, the picture it made. A woman on 80 acres alone through the summer, figuring out what needed doing and doing it, building a knowledge of the land piece by piece. That kind of knowledge doesn't come easy, and it doesn't come from someone else. It comes from paying attention alone over time, which is the way my father had taught me all worthwhile things came. In the evenings she'd take the papers, her deed, the filing documents, notes she'd made, and spread them on the table and work. Building the legal story of the land, she called it once. Every link in the chain from the original Greer plat to the present title, every date, every filing. She had a precise handwriting in the margins, small and tight, that covered every edge of the papers with notations I couldn't always follow but that I trusted. I'd sit at the other end of the table and do the ranch accounts or mend tack or sometimes just read, which I didn't usually allow myself time for. And the lamp was between us and the stove was going, and the horses were settled in the barn, and outside the November darkness was complete. I hadn't known I was lonely until it stopped. One evening she said, without looking up from the papers, what happened with the woman and the children, from the house? I said, the fire. She said, yes. I set down what I was working on. I checked on them afterward once, after I got out. The husband had come back, he was away working when it happened, and they'd rebuilt the house, a better one, and they were still there. I looked at the window. She recognized me, she didn't say much. She said, we know what you did. And I said I was glad they were well, and that was it. Callie said that was enough. I said it was, that surprised me. I thought I'd need more than that, but it was enough. She looked up from the papers. She said it was always going to be enough. You just had to wait until you could see it. I looked at her across the lamp. She went back to her papers. The riders came on a Tuesday morning, a week before the hearing. 2 of Cress's men. I was in the barn when I heard the horses and came to the door and stood there. I knew Rusk, he'd been Cress's foreman for years, a heavy-set man with careful eyes who'd learned when to push and when to let a thing sit, which made him more dangerous than a man who always pushed. The younger one I knew by type before I knew his face, That particular kind of stillness, the hands held loose and ready, the eyes doing everything from a neutral face. Rusk said, "Wills." I said, "Rusk." He looked around the yard with the deliberate quality of a man, making it known that he was looking. Looking for Callie. She was in the house and I kept my eyes off the house door. Rusk said, "Mr. Kress thought he'd give you the chance to be sensible about this before it went further." I said, "About what specifically?" "The Greer woman. She's a complication in a matter that was close to settled. You've made it more complicated." He tilted his head slightly. "Mr. Kress would appreciate it if you pointed her down the road and let this proceed the way it was going to proceed anyway." I looked at him. I said, "She's not mine to point anywhere." Rusk said, "She's a widow with a disputed title and no money left in this county and nowhere to be. She can't win what Kress is asking the court to settle. Whatever you've done for her in the short run, you've only made the landing harder for her in the long run. Be practical." I said, "What I know is that Gail Prute's survey puts a fixed rock formation 40 yards from where every other surveyor in this county's history has put it. And I know August Pell in the Harker Recorder's office has seen Prute's work before and made notes. And I know the original Greer plat predates Kress's adjacent title by 6 years." I looked at Rusk steadily. "You can tell Kress all of that." Rusk's face didn't change much. He was a man who'd been in enough situations to know when a thing had taken a shape he hadn't expected. He was recalculating. The younger man had moved his horse a half step to the right, opening up his angle. He was watching me with the specific attention I'd learned to recognize over years of hard work. The attention of a man who's running a scenario and waiting for a signal. I said to him specifically and clearly, "Keep your hands on the reins." He went still. Rusk said, "You're a man with a name that doesn't buy you much in this county, Wills. Whatever you think you're building here, it's on sand." I said, "I'm a man who stood on what was right when it cost me everything I had. I learned something from that. The cost doesn't change the right of it." I looked at him. "Go tell Kress." They rode out. I watched them all the way to the ridge and then went back to the barn and stood there for a moment with my hands on the wall and breathed. I heard the house door after a while and Callie came to the barn. She stood in the opening with her arms crossed. She said, "I heard." I said, "Good." She said, "You told him your name was one that didn't buy you much." I said, "In this county, that's true." She said, "Not with me." I looked at her. She said it plain, without heat or sentiment, the way she said things that were just true and didn't need dressing. "Whatever they've made of your name in this county, whatever that Sell and Harker put on it, that's not what I see." She looked at me straight. "I see a man who cuts ropes and rides women to safety and knows the right lawyer and takes on trouble that isn't his because leaving it alone isn't something he's able to do." She paused. "That's not a damaged name. That's a name worth something." I didn't say anything. I didn't trust my voice to come out level. She stood in the barn door for another moment. Then she said, "I'm not going anywhere, Cord. Not before this is settled. Maybe not after either." She went back to the house. I stood in the barn with a halter in my hands and the horses breathing around me, and I didn't move for a long time. The hearing was on a Thursday. We rode into Porterville the day before, which meant arriving in a town that was essentially Kress's and being seen in it. That was unavoidable. We stayed at the one hotel that I knew was independent of his bank, owned outright by a widow who'd paid off her note 3 years ago and had the paper to prove it, and we met Sefton there in the early evening. Sefton laid the documents out on the table in the hotel dining room. The deed, Pell's notation, the original Greer plat, and the new survey. The man from Colfax had come out 10 days before and worked 3 full days with an assistant, checking everything twice, and his report placed the benchmark formation within 8 inches of where Thomas Greer had placed it 55 years earlier. Sefton said, 4 surveys versus 1, 3 of them historical, one done 10 days ago by a licensed surveyor who has no connection to either party. He looked at us both. The historical surveys are harder for them to attack because the men who did them are dead and can't be questioned. The new one they can try to discredit, but to do that they'd have to attack the Colfax man's methods, and his methods are documented and standard. Callie said, "What's Cress likely to do?" Sefton was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He's introduced one thing in the filing that I want to prepare you for. A letter, allegedly from your husband before he died, indicating his willingness to sell the section at a specific price and attesting that he and Cress had an understanding." She stared at him. He said, "I've looked at it carefully. The stationery has a papermaker's mark. I've been in contact with the company, and the mark was not used before 1879. The letter is dated 1876. She said, "My husband died in 1877. Sefton said, "Yes. The letter can't have been written on that paper in 1876. It could have been written after 1879, backdated." He spread his hands. "I'll raise this. What the court does with it depends on Judge Crane." We looked at each other. Crane was the variable we couldn't control. Everything else was in the documents, and the documents were solid. But a judge who owed his appointment to the right men and wanted to survive in this county had options for how he read solid documents. That was what I lay awake thinking about that night. The courtroom. More people than I expected. Word had gotten around, apparently, either because the county enjoyed watching Cress get challenged, which happened rarely, or because enough people had interests in how the Creek section title came down. I recognized some faces and didn't recognize more. Cress was there in the front row, not at the table. His lawyer was at the table but present. He was a large man, well dressed in a way that read as natural rather than effortful, with a face that had found its permanent expression some years back and settled there. He looked at Callie when she came in and then at me, and the look was the kind that is designed to communicate a settled certainty, that this was a known conclusion being played out for form. I'd seen that look before, on different men. It sometimes reflected an accurate assessment, and sometimes was performance. With Cress, I thought it might be half of each. He looked at me, I looked back. He looked away. I didn't find significance in that, and I did not find significance in it. The hearing ran most of the morning. Cress's lawyer was capable. He presented the Prout survey with some technical competence, walked through the dispute history in the county with an apparent command of dates, and introduced the letter with a careful preamble about the long-standing nature of the understanding between Cress and the late Mr. Greer. He made it sound like a settled thing that an inconvenient widow was disrupting. When Sefton's turn came, he did what I'd watched him do before, which was to lay it out simply and let the weight accumulate. The letter first. He said the word watermark and spelled out what the watermark meant. Then he stopped talking and let the room do the arithmetic. The letter was dated before the paper that carried it existed. He didn't call Cress a liar. He didn't need to. Then the surveys, all 4 of them in sequence with the benchmark placement noted for each. He presented it as a table. He'd drawn it up on a large sheet of paper that he pinned to a board, and the numbers were plain. 4 surveys, one in 1871 and 3 since, all placing the formation within a few feet of each other. Prout's survey, placing it 40 yards away. He said, "The court is not being asked to determine whether Mr. Prout made an honest error or an intentional one. The court is being asked to determine which survey reflects the actual location of the terrain. On this point, the preponderance of the evidence is not close." Then Pell's notation. He read it into the record and had the certified copy admitted as an exhibit. Pell's name carried weight even in his absence. Then the deed and its precedents. Crane asked Cress's lawyer about the letter. The lawyer said the watermark issue was a matter of clerical uncertainty, and that the court should not draw conclusions from a production artifact about the authenticity of a document with other indicia of reliability. Crane looked at him for a moment with an expression that was very still, and then called a recess. 45 minutes in the hallway. Sefton said he thought it was going well, but that 45 minutes was long for a straightforward evidentiary matter, and he couldn't tell if that meant Crane was being careful or was consulting with someone. I thought about Cress in the courtroom, and whether there was a back channel from that room to the judge's chambers, and decided that thinking about it wasn't useful. Callie sat on the bench with her back straight and her hands in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance, and she was the stillest person in the hallway. I sat beside her. After a while she put her hand on the bench between us, not touching me, just placing it there. I put mine near it, not touching either. That was enough. When we went back in, Crane talked for a while in the careful legal language that I'd learned to follow, but not to take literally until it arrived at its conclusion. He talked about title precedents, about evidentiary standards for displacing a registered deed, about the value of recorded surveys in establishing disputed boundaries. He was measuring his words and setting them down precisely, which was either the habit of a careful judge or the habit of a man building a record that would survive review. When he got to the letter, he said the provenance question raised by the watermark created a weight of evidence problem that he was disinclined to overlook. When he got to the survey, he said that a counter-survey deviating from 4 independent historical and contemporary surveys by 40 yards on a fixed formation was not sufficient to displace a title of record. He denied the counterclaim. He affirmed Callie's title. He said any future challenge would require substantially stronger evidence. He dismissed. The room made a sound. Not organized, not loud, just the particular exhale of a room where something has resolved. Cress stood and walked out. He didn't look at us. His lawyer closed his case file with the careful movements of a man managing his face. Sefton put his hand on my shoulder and said something I don't quite remember. I think I said something back. Outside in the cold, Callie was holding the deed. She'd had it in her coat all through the hearing, and she'd taken it out when Crane announced the ruling, just held it, and she was still holding it in both hands on the courthouse steps, with the cold afternoon light coming down at a flat angle. I stood beside her, and we looked at the street. People were passing who had no idea what had just happened in that building. Horses at the hitch rail, a wagon being loaded, 2 men talking in the doorway of the dry goods across the street. She said, "It's real." I said, "It's yours, always was." She looked at the deed in her hands and then up at me, and what was in her face was not soft. Callie Greer was not a soft person, and that was one of the things I'd come to understand was worth more than soft would have been. What was in her face was certain and clear and directed at me in a way that I felt somewhere behind my sternum. She said, "Cord." I said, "Yeah." She said, "I want to say something and I want you to let me finish." I said I would. She said, "You pulled a rope off a windmill frame and brought me to your house with nothing to gain from it. And then you stood in a bank and asked the right question. And then you rode 40 miles and introduced me to a man who knew things that mattered. And then you stood in your own yard and told Cress's man what the situation was, in front of a man who would have put a gun on you if you'd flinched." She paused. "And you did all of that with a name that this county has done its best to make into a burden, and you never once acted like it was a burden." She stepped forward and she put her hand on my chest, flat, over the coat, over my heart. She looked up at me. She said, "They called you oath breaker once upon a time because you chose a woman and her children over a man who signed your check. I want you to know what I think that makes you." Her hand pressed slightly. "It makes you the only man I've trusted since I stopped trusting easily, and I don't trust easily anymore." I put my hand over hers. She didn't pull back, she just looked at me. I said, "I want to build on that land with you, the section and mine together. I've been thinking about how it'd work, and it works well, the water on your side and the grass on mine and the cattle moving between them the way cattle do when the fencing's right. I looked at her. And I'd like to do that as your husband, if you're willing. She was quiet for a long moment. The cold was real, and the street sounds were real, and the light was going gray around us. Then she said, "I'm willing, Cord wills." She said it plain and final, the way she said things she meant. That was 2 years ago. We married in March in the front room of my father's house, with Sefton and August Pell and a preacher from Bream. No ceremony to speak of. Neither of us wanted ceremony. We wanted the fact of it, and we got that. The section's built up now. We put up a proper house on the creek land in the first spring. Callie had opinions about what proper meant, and she was right about all of them. Good foundation, good stove, the south windows she'd asked for that catch the afternoon light. In the mornings that light comes across the kitchen table and sits there like something patient and earned. We run 42 head between the 2 pieces of land, which work as one now in all the ways that matter. The creek water on her side feeds the south pasture on mine during dry years when my well runs slow. In summer the grass comes up green clear to the tree line on both sides of the old fence line, which we've mostly taken down now. Cress is still in the county. Men like that don't leave, they have too much anchored there. But 3 of the smaller ranchers he'd been pressing on water rights went together to the territorial governor's office with some documentation about the bank practices, and there's been an inquiry for about 8 months now. I don't know where it ends. I know it started because those ranchers saw what happened in the Porterville courthouse and understood that Cress could be beaten on the record. Russ quit the outfit in early spring and went to Nevada as far as I heard. The younger man, whose name I never learned, I don't know, gone somewhere. Pell came to see us before he retired and moved east. He sat at our table and had coffee and didn't say much, which was his way. Before he left he shook my hand and held it for a moment and said, "Your father would have been proud of you, Cord." I held on to that. Still hold on to it. Sefton came once too, in the summer, on other business in the county. He and Callie talked for a long time about property law and precedent, and he shook his head once or twice and said he'd never seen a client build a case as well on her own before he got to it. She said she'd had good material to work with. He looked at me and raised his coffee cup, and I raised mine. There are mornings, most mornings now, when I come out before light and stand on the porch of the old house and look at both pieces of land in the gray before sunrise. The cattle are shapes in the pasture. The windmill on the south tank turns if there's any wind at all, which I fixed properly the fall after Callie came. The pump works. The tank fills. The cattle come to it the way cattle always come to good water, without ceremony, without question, because it's there and it's reliable. Callie comes out after a while with coffee. She knows I'm not ready for talking first thing, and she's the same. We just stand. I think about my father on those mornings, and the things he knew that can't be written down. I think about the lesson he gave me that I didn't know was a lesson until I was old enough to need it. That things connect in ways you can't always see from where you're standing, and that paying attention is the only way to find the connections, and that the connections matter more than anything you think you're building when you're building alone. I think about a wet rope and a woman who had 20 hours to decide what she was before I got there, and who had already decided. I think about a courtroom and a judge and 45 minutes in a hallway, and a hand on my chest and 3 plain words. I think about what it meant to stand between a person and the kind of man who uses signed slates and windmill posts as tools, and to stand there with nothing but a damaged name and a clear knowledge of right, and what the standing turned out to be worth. My father used to say that the land doesn't care what you've been through. It just asks what you're going to do with it now. He meant it about the land itself, the grass, the water, the work of keeping a piece of ground productive and whole. But I've come to think he meant it about everything, about the years in between and the cost of doing right and the question of what you do with what you have left. I know what I've done with it. The light comes up slow on a clear morning. It starts gray and goes gold by the time it clears the ridge east of us, and it comes across the land in a long, flat angle that shows you every fold and hollow in the grass, every dry wash, every post line. It shows you what's there. We stand on the porch and we look at it. And that is enough. That is the exactly right amount. I want to go back and tell you about those 3 weeks more carefully, because they were the real thing and I don't want to pass over them too fast. The work was constant, the way fall work always is. The fencing I mentioned, that was the biggest piece of it, but there was also the matter of the root cellar, which had taken water in a late rain and needed the corner stones reset before winter came in hard and turned that moisture to ice and pushed the stones further. Ice is patient in ways that rock isn't. If you don't deal with it in the fall, you deal with 3 times the problem in March. Callie helped with the root cellar too. She knew how to use a mattock and she didn't swing it like someone who'd been handed a tool they weren't sure about. She swung it like someone who'd cleared ground before, short clean strokes, weight from the shoulder not the arms, keeping her back straight. I watched her work for a while before I understood she didn't need watching. I asked her where she'd learned to use one. She said, I cleared half an acre of sage on the claim in the first year, by myself, with a mattock and a grubbing hoe. I thought about that. Half an acre of sage by hand. That's not an afternoon's work. That's weeks of it, the kind of work that leaves you unable to make a fist in the evening, the kind that you wake up in the middle of the night feeling in your forearms. She said, I was angry that year. It helped. I said, angry at what? She thought about it. At myself mostly, for marrying a man I didn't fully know, for being in a position where I needed 80 acres and couldn't afford to hire anyone to improve it. She reset her grip on the handle. That anger was useful. I put it into the ground and cleared half an acre. I said, and then? She said, then I was less angry, and the ground was clear. She swung the mattock. That was the way she operated. Direct, efficient, without wasted motion. She'd assess a problem and then deal with it, and the dealing was always physical and precise. She reminded me, in that, of my father, though I didn't say so because it might have sounded like a strange kind of compliment. To me, it wasn't strange at all. The second week, the surveyor from Colfax arrived. His name was Hadfield, and he came with an assistant, a young man who carried the instrument cases, and seemed to be learning the trade by carrying things and listening carefully. Hadfield himself was a compact, weathered man in his 50s with the particular deliberateness of someone whose work requires precision and who has built his habits around it. He didn't waste words and he didn't waste measurements. He and his assistant spent 3 days on the land. They worked the section from the original Greer benchmark and then cross-referenced every other fixed point they could find, the road junction, the section corners on the adjacent land, the creek bend that showed on 3 historical maps. They ran their lines twice, which Hadfield said he always did on disputed surveys because once was for the data and twice was for the court. I rode out with him on the second day to show him the benchmark formation, the rock face on the east rise that every survey in the county had used as a reference for 50 years. He looked at it, and then at his instruments, and then back at it and wrote in his notebook. I said, is it where everyone else says it is? He said, within 2 feet of the 1871 placement. The formation hasn't moved naturally, but there's some differential in exactly where you take the reading from. He made another notation. Whatever survey places this 40 yards north has either made an extraordinary error or made a deliberate choice. He was careful not to say which. That wasn't his job. His job was the numbers. When he was done on the 3rd day, he told me he'd have the written report ready within a week and that Sefton could come collect it or he'd send a copy. He shook my hand and said, good piece of land, that creek section. Whoever holds it will do well by it. I said, she will. He looked at me for a moment, then at the section, and then he nodded and rode off with his assistant behind him. The night the surveyor left, I had a dream about the cell in Harker. I don't have it often anymore. I had it constantly in the first year, every few nights, and then it tapered off. Sometimes it comes back when I'm under pressure, which makes sense. The mind goes to its old wounds when the new troubles echo them. In the dream, it's always the same. The dimensions of the cell, which were precise and I remember exactly. 8 feet by 11, the longer dimension running east to west. A single window too high to see through that showed a narrow band of sky. The smell of the place, which was rust and wet stone, and the particular close smell of a man sleeping in his clothes for weeks. In the dream, I'm sitting in it, and I know I'm going to get out, but I also know that getting out is going to mean stepping into a world that has organized itself around the assumption that I'm what they said I was. And that's the part that was hard. Not the cell. The cell you can endure if you know you were right. It's the after that's hard, the getting out, and the stepping into the new shape people have put your name in. I woke from it and lay there in the dark for a while. Then I heard Callie in the main room. She was up too, and I heard the sound of the stove being opened and closed, which meant she was building up the fire that had gone low. Night sounds, domestic sounds, the kind you don't notice until they're there, and then you notice them constantly. I lay in the dark and listened to the fire catch and the sounds of the house settling in the cold, and I thought, this is what was on the other side of all of it. My father's land and a woman who knew the right way to swing a mattock. I hadn't been able to see it from the cell. I hadn't been able to see it from the years after either, working this place alone and being sufficient and nothing more. You can't always see where a road goes when you're on it. You just keep going and trust that if you did right along the way, the place you end up will be worth ending up in. Midway through the second week, there was a different kind of pressure. I rode into Porterville for supplies, flour, salt, a new file for the saw, a handful of other things, and I noticed the quality of the town's attention. That's something you learn after years of having a name people know. How a room feels when you walk into it, whether the awareness of you is neutral or charged. This was charged. The man at the mercantile took my list and filled it without conversation, which was his right, but the silence had a different texture than usual. 2 men outside the saloon watched me tie my horse and didn't look away when I looked back. I went to the post office, and the postmaster, who'd always been decent in a minimal way, said good morning, and then very specifically did not ask how I was or offer any of the ordinary social filler that people use in small towns to make the space between strangers comfortable. Cress was making it known. Nothing specific, nothing actionable, just that quiet pressure, the adjustment of the social temperature, the communication without words that says this person is in dispute with a man of consequence, and it would be wise to mark your distance. I'd felt it before, after Harker. The difference was that after Harker I was alone and I had nothing to weigh against it. Now I had the land and the case we were building and Callie in the bunkhouse, who was building the legal record one careful notation at a time. The pressure was the same, but what it was pressing against was different. I bought my supplies and loaded them on the horse and rode back out. When I got back, Callie was at the fence line, helping me check a section I'd been meaning to get to, and she looked up when I rode in and read something on my face. She said town was cold. I said some. She said good. I looked at her. She said if Cress is spending energy applying social pressure, he's not spending it on something worse, and social pressure is the kind of thing that clears up fast after a courtroom ruling. She went back to the wire. Let him spend it. I thought about that. She was right. It was the move of a man who'd run out of cleaner options, at least for the moment. He couldn't come at the legal case directly because Sefton and Pell had built it solid. He couldn't come at me directly because what he'd have to spend to do it wasn't worth it for a parcel of land, even that one. So he was working the margins. I said, you've thought about him a lot. She said, you think about the things that are trying to take your land. You understand them. She twisted the wire end and secured it around the post. Cress is not complicated. He's a man who is used to things going his way because he has money and influence, and he's been operating here for 20 years without serious opposition. He's not a genius and he's not particularly ruthless, he's just accustomed. She moved to the next post. The accustomed are easier than the desperate. They lose their composure faster when things don't go the way they expect. I said the letter, with the wrong watermark. She said yes, and there was something in that one word, a cold satisfaction that I thought was entirely earned. 3 days before the hearing, Sefton came out to the ranch. He arrived in the early afternoon, having ridden from Bream, and he looked road-tired but focused. We sat at the table, the three of us, and he went through what would happen at the hearing in sequence, telling us what to expect, what he expected from Cress's lawyer, and how he intended to respond to each. He said the letter was his opening move. Get it on the table early, establish that the provenance was questionable, and let the taint of it color everything that came after. Then the surveys. Then the deed precedents. Callie had questions about procedure, about the standard for admitting documentary evidence, about the record Pell's notation would create, and how it would interact with the testimony. They were precise questions, the kind that came from having read carefully and thought it through. Sefton answered them without condescension and then said, "You should have been a lawyer." She said, "I should have been a lot of things. Right now I'm a landowner trying to stay one." He smiled. "That's the right answer." He had supper with us and rode back to town. At the door he paused and said, "Cord, whatever happens in that courtroom, and I believe it'll go right, you've done good work here. Not just the legal work, the kind that doesn't show up in documents." I said I just paid attention. He said, "That's usually all it is." The night before the hearing I couldn't sleep. Callie couldn't either. I knew it from the sounds of the house. The particular silence of a person lying awake has a different texture than the silence of a person sleeping. At some point past midnight, I got up and put the fire up and put coffee on, and after a few minutes she came out of the back room in her coat. She sat at the table, and I poured coffee for both of us, and we sat with the lamp between us and the window dark behind it. She said, "Tell me something that isn't about tomorrow." I thought about that. I told her about a winter when I was maybe 14, the year before my mother died, when we had 3 weeks of weather so cold the creek froze solid at the crossing, and the cattle wouldn't come down from the ridge because the wind up there, strange as it seemed, was less punishing than the cold in the valley bottom. My father and I rode up every morning to push them down to feed. 3 weeks of it every day before dawn. The cold so hard your breath turned to ice on your collar before you'd been riding 10 minutes. I said, one morning my father stopped on the ridge and got down off his horse. I didn't know why. He just stood there looking east, and I got down and stood with him. And after a while I could see what he was looking at. The sun was coming up still below the horizon, but the sky was that deep cold blue that goes right before the light changes. And there was a line of geese going south, late geese, and you could hear them in the silence. I stopped. She said, "What did your father say?" I said, "Nothing. He just looked at it for a minute and then he got back on his horse and we went to push the cattle down." I looked at the lamp. He didn't say anything about it then or later, but I've thought about it probably 500 times. She was quiet for a while. She said, "He was showing you something." I said, "Yeah." I just couldn't figure out what exactly until I got older. She said, "What do you think now?" I said that some things matter and some don't, and the trick is to know the difference, and that sometimes you can't know the difference until you stop, really stop, not just pause and look at what's in front of you. I turned my cup. He was good at stopping. She reached across the table and put her hand on mine for a moment, just a moment. Then she took it back and picked up her coffee. She said, "We're going to be all right tomorrow." I said, "I believe that." She said, "So do I." We sat by the lamp until it was close enough to morning that getting up made more sense than trying to sleep. And so I'll end where I began, with 2 years past and the land running together the way it should, and the mornings on the porch that I've tried to describe. There's something I didn't know how to say earlier that I want to try now, because it matters and I've been circling it. A man can spend years being hardened, years being practical, years learning to expect the cost of doing right and accepting it and moving on, and letting the acceptance of the cost become its own kind of armor. You lose enough and you stop holding your hands out for things. You get careful. You get sufficient. And then something happens that asks something of you, and you find you're still capable. That the years of hardening didn't take out the part that moves toward a person in trouble. That the armor was over something, not instead of something. That's what I found that morning at the Windmill. And what came after, Callie at the fence and Callie at the table, and Callie on the courthouse steps in the cold with a deed in her hands and her hand on my chest saying what she said, what that did was not just give me something good. What it did was show me that the person I'd been all along, the one who'd cut the rope instead of reading the sign, was the right one. That the cell in Harker and the damaged name and the years of sufficiency were not a verdict. They were just years. My father knew how to stop and look at things. I'm learning. In the mornings on the porch in the gray light before the sun comes up, with Callie beside me and the land spread out below us and the windmill turning in whatever wind there is, in those mornings I'm stopped. I'm looking. And what I see is worth seeing. That's the whole of it. There are a few more things I want to say about the period between Rusk's visit and the hearing, because I skipped over some of it, and that section deserves its full weight. After the writers came and when I spent the better part of a day doing nothing useful. I mean, I was working, mending harness in the barn, which is the kind of work that occupies your hands without demanding your mind, but my mind was elsewhere and the harness work showed it. I had to redo 2 splices I'd done wrong by not paying attention, which is not something that usually happens to me. What I was thinking about was risk. Specifically, what I'd taken on and what it might still cost. Cress was not finished because a couple of riders came back empty. That wasn't how men like him operated. He'd absorbed the information that I knew about the survey and Pell's notation, and he'd gone back to plan the next move. I had no way of knowing what the next move was. It might be legal, something else in the court, another filing, a way to delay the hearing or complicate the case. It might be harder. In my experience with this kind of man, the harder moves came when the legal ones were running out, and the harder moves usually came at night, with fire or with someone who was very good at making things look accidental. I didn't say any of this to Callie. She knew it already. She'd been living under Cress's pressure for months, and she'd thought further into it than I had, probably. She didn't need me to inventory the dangers for her. What I did instead was move the horses from the south pasture to the closer corral, which I could see from the house window. I checked the barn lock, which was never much of a lock but at least told you if something had been in there. I started sleeping lighter, which isn't hard for me. I've always slept with part of my attention on the dark outside, which is probably a habit from the years of riding for other men in uncertain situations. You don't stop sleeping that way just because the situation changes. The second night after the riders came, around 2 in the morning, I heard a horse on the road past the gate. I was up and had my rifle before the sound finished registering. I went to the window, one rider moving at a walk, not stopping, going past, not turning in. Could have been anyone. A rider coming back from town late, an animal moving, a man with business in the next county. I watched until the sound faded. I stood at the window for a while after. Then I went and sat in the chair near the stove, which is what I do when I know I'm not going to sleep again right away. I sat there, and the fire made its sound, and the house was quiet, and after a while I heard Callie's door open. She came out and looked at me. She said, "Ryder." I said, "Just the one," kept going. She sat in the other chair without being asked. We sat there in the near dark for a while. The fire lit us from below, which gives everyone an unfamiliar face. Hers was serious and quiet, not scared. She said, "I want to tell you something." I waited. She said, "When they put me on that windmill, I wasn't sure anyone would come. It was a weeknight and that land doesn't get much traffic, and I'd been watching the light go and thinking about the temperature." She paused. "I decided that if nobody came by morning, I was going to find a way to break the frame or break my hands free, even if I had to wreck my hands doing it. I wasn't going to be found there." I looked at her. She said, "I tell you that not because I think you need to know it, but because I want you to understand who you were dealing with when you came over that rise." Her face was steady. "I'm not someone who needs rescuing. I needed the rope cut, which is a different thing. After that I was going to handle whatever needed handling." I said, "I know that." She said, "Good, because what you've done in the weeks since is stand alongside me, not in front of me, and that matters." She looked at the fire. "My husband was a decent man, as I said, but he handled things in front of me. He thought he was protecting me, and maybe sometimes he was, but what it left me with was a claim I didn't fully understand and debts I didn't know about and arrangements I'd never been party to." She looked back at me. "You've shown me the bank and the recorder and the lawyer. You've told me what you know and what you're thinking and what you're uncertain about. You've worked the problem with me." She said, "That's what I mean when I say I'd have you." I said, "I know." She said, "Do you?" I said, "A man can know something in pieces before he knows it whole. I've known pieces of it since about the third day." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Go to sleep, Cord. We've got work in the morning." She went back to her room. I sat by the fire a little longer. The morning of the hearing, I did something that I hadn't done in a long time. I went out before light and walked to the south fence. Not the far one, just the near one. The one that marks where my father's original 40 acres ended before he started adding. I stood there with my hand on the fence post, which was one he'd set himself, locust wood that had been in the ground for 30 years and was harder than new timber, and I said a few words to him. I don't know if that means anything, talking to the dead. My father would have said it was a sentimental habit, but he would have done it too, I think, in a situation like this one, if his father had set the post. I told him about Callie. I told him what the land was going to become. I told him I'd done right along the way and that it had cost me, and that I'd do it the same again, and that I thought he knew that, but I wanted to say it out loud to him on his ground. Then I went in and we got ready and rode to Porterville. There's one more thing about the courthouse that I didn't describe, which was what happened right before Crane came back in from his recess. I was sitting in the hallway with Callie on my left and Sefton on my right, and Sefton was saying something about procedure, and I wasn't listening very well because I was looking at Callie. She had the deed in her coat. She'd put her hand over it without realizing, the way you put your hand over something that matters. And her face was composed and forward-looking, and she was breathing slowly and carefully, the same way she'd breathed through the rope burns coming back in her hands on the first morning, counting through it, staying level. I thought about all the things she'd done alone, the half-acre of sage, the 3 years of working the claim in the summers, the 4 refusals to cress, the night on the windmill post with the cold and the dark and nobody coming, deciding what she'd do if nobody did. I thought about what a man gets to be if he's beside someone like that, what it asks of him and what it gives back. The bailiff opened the courtroom door and called us in. I put my hand briefly on her arm, just briefly, just for a second, and she looked at me and nodded once, and we went in. And it went the way it went. And here we are. The land runs together. The cattle move between the 2 sections the way water moves, looking for the path of least resistance, finding the good grass, coming to the water. We put a new gate in the old fence line in the spring, wide enough for the cattle to move through easy, and we've left it standing open ever since because there's no reason to close it. The windmill on the south tank turns. The light comes up in the morning and comes across the land flat and certain. She stands beside me in the early cold, and she doesn't need to say anything, and neither do I. A man spends years being sufficient, and then he finds out what sufficient was holding space for. That's the only way I know to say it. I cut her down from the windmill post because it was the thing to do. Everything after that was the things that had always been true about both of us, finding each other and holding. That's the story, that's all of it. I've told you the large pieces. Let me tell you a few small ones, because the small ones are what a life is made of, and you can't understand the large pieces without them. The sorrel mare. I gave her to Callie formally, not as a gift exactly, more as an acknowledgement that she'd already made the horse hers in every way that counted. The mare had come to know the sound of her step and would turn toward it in the stall. Horses do that. They know who they belong to before you decide, and then they show you. I told Callie the mare was hers, and she looked at me and said she already knew that, but she said it in a way that meant, "Thank you for saying it out loud." The garden. Callie put one in on the south side of the house that first spring, in the ground I'd been meaning to break for 6 years and never had. She asked me where I kept the seed, and I said I didn't keep seed, and she looked at me with a particular kind of patience, and went to town and came back with paper envelopes and spent a morning planting rows. The garden that came up that summer was better than any I'd seen on this place since my mother's, which is saying something because my mother's garden was the reason my father kept it going for years after she was gone. I didn't say that to Callie. Some things you hold. The bunkhouse. We cleaned it out properly in the spring, and I put new boards on the floor and new chinking between the logs and fixed the door so it hung straight. Callie had an idea about using it for additional storage as we expanded the operation. I had a different idea, that eventually we might need it for a hired hand, if the cattle numbers grew the way I thought they would. We talked about it and didn't settle it, and then we agreed to wait until we needed to decide. That's a way of talking that I've learned from her. Not every question needs an answer today. The question can wait. The land will show you what it needs. The letter my sister sent. I have a sister in Kansas, younger than me, who I'd been out of contact with for the better part of 8 years. She'd heard through some chain of people I couldn't trace that I'd been in trouble, and then that I was on a piece of land and managing. I wrote to her in the winter after the hearing, told her the basic shape of things. She wrote back in a month, and the letter was warm and direct, and she said she'd always known I'd end up on solid ground eventually, that I was built for it, and she asked when she could meet Callie. Callie read the letter and said, "She sounds like someone worth knowing." I wrote back and said we'd have her for a summer visit, which I intend to do. The slate. I didn't burn it or bury it or make any particular gesture about it. I left it in the mud at the base of the windmill post that first morning, and I never went back for it. By the time I got back to fix the pump a few days later, it was gone, washed away in a rain probably, or taken by someone who'd been curious about the story. I didn't look for it. Some things you don't need to mark the ending of. The pump on the south tank runs right. I put a new rod on it that second winter and sealed the casing where it had been weeping, and the water comes up clean and steady. You can hear the windmill from the house when the wind is from the west, which it usually is. That particular metal sound, the slow creak and turn of it. Some nights I lie awake and listen to it, and it's as satisfying a sound as I know. Water coming up, tank filling. Cattle coming to it in the morning without being called, because reliable things don't need announcing. That's what I was after, I think, all along. Not the particular shape of things, not the specific story, just the sense that what you've built can be counted on, that the things you set in motion will keep moving after you stop tending them, that you've put something in the world that's solid, that will hold. I have that now. Callie's beside me. The land's below us. The windmill's turning. I couldn't ask for more than that, and I'm not asking.